All right. Well, good morning, everyone. We are at part 3 of our Bible in a Year. That's the right slide. In our Bible in a Year series. And today we are going to look at the entire book of Job. We started it last week. We looked at chapters 1 and 2. I know there's a little bit set for next week's reading plan. Sorry, I'm going to spoil the ending for you. We'll just go ahead and do this from start to finish this morning. This is a picture or a diagram of the book of Job, a timeline of it, if you will. There's a lot of chapters in here, but there's a logical breakdown with all of this. The first part we talked about last week, and it's the introduction. This is chapter 1. We're introduced to Job. We find out that he is a wealthy man. We find out that he is a godly man. But then we also see the first round of trials that take place in his life. We have this conversation between God and Satan that occurs in heaven. And you guys remember this, but Satan accused Job, saying that he only is such a God-fearing man because God treats him so well. So God allowed him to be handed over to Satan to be tested with some restriction. Satan just couldn't hurt his body. So that was the first chapter. And then we moved on to the second chapter where we have a second round of trials. Job stands up just fine under the tremendous trials that befell him. Almost all of his wealth was wiped out. His children were killed, but he still did not curse God. And so the second conversation in heaven happens where Satan says, well, the only reason why Job's still holding on and not cursing you is because you haven't let me afflict his body. And so God allows him to do that. There's a second round of trials. Job's friends show up, and I think that's where we left it. Most of the rest of the book, then, is a series of conversations between Job and his friends and a couple of other people that we'll get to, and it's several rounds of this. The first round of conversations runs from chapters 3 to chapter 14. It's this first round of dialogue between Job and his friends, and all of his friends are very interested in taking Job to task for the situation that he is in. And so chapter 3, Job starts talking. This is after he'd been silent for a while, and he just immediately begins complaining about his situation. Chapters 4 and 5, his good friend Eliphaz replies to Job. Chapter 6 and 7, Job responds to Eliphaz. In chapter 8, his dear friend Bildad speaks up and replies to Job and challenges him. And then chapters 9 and 10, Job responds to Bildad. Chapter 11, his friend Zophar jumps in and responds to Job. I don't know why these names aren't still in use today, but that's what's happening. And then chapters 12 through 14, Job responds to Zophar. So what you're seeing here is this sort of back and forth between Job and his friends. Back and forth and back and forth, right? And this happens several more times, right? There's this back and forth between each of his friends and Job. The first round, the second round starts and goes from chapters 15 through 21. A second round of dialogue between Job and his friends. And it happens in the same order that it did before. Chapter 15, Eliphaz attacks Job again. Chapter 16 through 17, Job responds. Chapter 18, Bildad jumps in and he takes his turn attacking Job. Chapter 19, Job replies back. Chapter 20, Zophar tags in and he attacks Job. And chapter 21, Job responds to him. That's the second round of conversations. And we move to the third round, and the third round of back and forth is the same order again as before, but this time it's a little bit different. Chapter 22, Eliphaz starts out again as he has done the other times. Chapters 23 and 24, Job responds. And then chapter 25, Bildad chimes in, but he doesn't say very much. He only gets out 6 verses by now. Chapter 25, everything that was going to be said has been said exhaustively. He has very little left to say. But chapters 26 through 31, Job just goes on a tear and he pushes back on all of them. He rants for 6 chapters. And then it would be Zophar's turn to speak as you would expect from the previous pattern, but this time he stays silent because there is absolutely nothing left to say, because every single word in the Hebrew language has already been used like 100 times by now. There's nothing left to say. But apparently there is, because in the very next section of the book, this other gentleman named Elihu shows up, and he feels the need to add to the conversation, and he attacks Job's friends, and he says that they're not really addressing Job's points, and he's on target with all of that, but then he turns and he attacks Job as well. Then finally in chapter 38, God steps in and God just tears everybody apart, and that runs through chapter 41, where we have the final words from Job, and there's an epilogue, and it puts a nice little bow on the whole thing. And that, my friends, is the book of Job. So the men would like to come forward for communion. No, I'm just kidding. We'll jump into this a little bit more, but we can't cover it all in tremendous depth here, but there are some really important points here for us to work through. So we'll jump in. Last week, we already covered chapters 1 and 2, so not going to look at those in any more depth. That's the setup to everything. We've summarized that already. But if we move on here to the first round of dialogue between Job and his friends, I'm going to go ahead and turn there. At the end of chapter 2, as we saw last week, Job's friends showed up and they sat with him for a week and they cried with him and nobody said anything, right? It was just such a moving experience. They just sat with him. But now in chapter 3, Job speaks, and here's the first part of that, verses 1 through 10 of chapter 3. After this, Job opened his mouth and cursed the day of his birth. He said, "May the day of my birth perish, and the night that said a boy is conceived. That day may it turn to darkness. May God above not care about it. May no light shine on it. May gloom and utter darkness claim it once more. May a cloud settle over it. May blackness overwhelm it. That night may thick darkness seize it. May it not be included among the days of the year, nor be entered in any of the months. May that night be barren. May no shout of joy be heard in it. May those who curse days curse that day, those who are ready to rouse Leviathan. May its morning stars become dark. May it wait for daylight in vain and not see the first rays of dawn, for it did not shut the doors of the womb on me to hide trouble from my eyes." So Job speaks and Job curses the day that he was born. And this is important for us to recognize what's going on here. We mentioned last week, one of the problems with the book, one of the big misconceptions of the book of Job is it's often thought of as this book where you've got this guy Job, and for a large number of chapters, he's just getting hit with problems left and right, and they all roll off of him like water off a duck's back because he has so much faith. And that's not at all what happened. As we pointed out last week, actually the sum total of Job's trials only lasts for 8 verses, 7 in chapter 1 and 1 verse in chapter 2. And the whole rest of the book is Job responding to those trials. It's him suffering through all of this. And the reality of the matter is how Job dealt with it is very, very human, and that's what makes this book so relatable and so important to us. We noted before, and it's worth bringing up again, Job, as he was experiencing these things and trying to deal with them, he only had partial information, right? We have the luxury of seeing that conversation between Satan and God before Job gets afflicted with these trials. Job did not. He did not have access to that information at all. And we see Job standing up under the trials and maintaining his faith so beautifully and so importantly, but we also see him wallowing in misery. It's a very human reaction. Job, as you read through this book, you will notice he did not exemplify James chapter 1 verse 2 that we've been working through. Consider it pure joy, my brothers and sisters, when you face trials of many kinds. Job was not doing that, and can't really blame him too much or be too hard on him for not doing that. going through a lot, and he was experiencing some trials. And so this is important for us to recognize as we read through this. We see from these pages that Job is imperfect. We are imperfect. Job, despite his challenges, ultimately he's going to suffer well through all of this. But the fact that his flaws are on full display for us to see, the fact that we're going to find ourselves tempted to look at our suffering the way Job did, Job is going to be the standard for us in suffering. And throughout this book, God shows this incredibly human side of him, and as such, he becomes fully relatable to us rather than just some comic book hero guy who went through a lot. And that, my friends, is what makes this story so very, very good. Job continues with his rant, and then Eliphaz speaks. Job's friends have been sitting silently with him for a week, right? That was the end of chapter 2. But once Job decides to speak up, his friends then feel the need to jump in and add their 2 cents. As we mentioned already, Eliphaz chimes in first, and for the first few sentences, it all sounds very nice and diplomatic. And then he moves into some bad theology that you guys are going to recognize, and then he's going to just go straight into laying into Job. Here's chapter 4, verses 1 through 7. Then Eliphaz the Temanite replied, "If someone ventures a word with you, will you be impatient? But who can keep from speaking? Think how you have instructed many, how you have strengthened feeble hands. Your words have supported those who stumbled. You have strengthened faltering knees. But now trouble comes to you, and you are discouraged. It strikes you, and you are dismayed. Should not your piety be your confidence, and your blameless ways your hope? Consider now, who being innocent has ever perished? Where were the upright ever destroyed?" So again, Eliphaz starts out with a little bit of flattery here in verses 3 and 4, and then where does he go? He goes straight to the doctrine of divine retribution. We see that at the end of the part we just read, and then he's going to go on and on about that, and the others are going to talk about divine retribution too. And if you remember from our study of Ecclesiastes, Solomon brought up the doctrine of divine revolution a lot, didn't he? And every time he brought it up, he was challenging it. The doctrine of divine retribution, as you remember, states that God is all-powerful, God is everywhere, and as such, God always punishes all bad behavior immediately, and God always rewards all good behavior immediately as well. And this is what most of the world believed in the time of Solomon, and that's why Solomon said, this is a problem under the sun, because people believe in this doctrine of divine retribution, yet I have seen good guys fail, and I have seen bad guys get ahead. This is meaningless life under the sun. You guys remember this. Solomon took this apart piece by piece. So in the time of Solomon, the doctrine of divine retribution was quite alive and well, but it was obviously alive and well during Job's time too, and it was just as bad then as it was in the time of Solomon. And you can't just excuse these guys and say, well, they didn't have Ecclesiastes, so they wouldn't know this isn't right, because in the very words that Eliphaz said, you can see the whole thing is bunk. Let me reread verse 7. "Consider now, who being innocent has ever perished? Where were the upright ever destroyed?" Well, how about Genesis chapter 4? What about Abel, the first generation out of the garden? Right? It happens immediately once the human race has fallen. So the doctrine of divine retribution makes no sense at all. But fortunately, Job's friends don't let something like the truth get in the way of their arguments. So Eliphaz takes Job to task for all of the sins he must have committed for this tragedy to have befallen him. Job responds, talking more about the depths of his suffering, and he starts pushing back on the whole divine retribution thing. He claims he didn't do anything that deserves this. He doesn't claim to be a sinless man, but the point is, says he's not been involved in any of the crazy habitual sin that the doctrine of divine retribution would have suggested he would have been involved in to make these particular things happen to him as a result. Bildad weighs in chapter 8, and he makes much the same argument that Eliphaz did. Doctrine of divine retribution, divine retribution. And then Job responds to Bildad starting in chapter 9, and it's kind of amazing what he says. His friends have been saying, divine retribution, and Job keeps saying back to them, I didn't do anything to earn God's special wrath here. And Bildad says in the beginning of his speech that Job's protestations are tantamount to him accusing God of perverting justice. Right? Doctrine of divine retribution is why this is happening to you, Job. I didn't do anything wrong. How dare you accuse God of perverting justice? He's doing this to you because of divine retribution. So the logic here is you are being punished because of your sin. You're saying you didn't sin. Therefore, Job, you must be saying that God is either wrong or malicious. And Job starts speaking and dreaming of being able to make his case before God. And he says in chapter 9, verses 32 through 35, talking about if he could make this case before God, he, God, is not a mere mortal like me that I might answer him, that we might confront each other in court. If only there was someone to mediate between us, someone to bring us together, someone to remove God's rod from me so that this terror would frighten me no more, then I would speak up without fear of him. But as it now stands with me, I cannot. What a beautiful, beautiful statement from Job. And I think Job has no idea what he's saying here in the grand scheme of things. But to those of us who are living in a time where we have the luxury of having the entire Bible, we see in these words in chapter 9, Job is crying out for Jesus. And again, I don't think Job understands this or knows the global significance of what he's saying. But his statement, this passage here, this is everything. All of us have sinned and fallen short of the glory of God. And the Bible tells us that the wages of our sin is death. And so for all of us, when we come to realize this, when this becomes apparent to us, we find ourselves in a position that's really worse than the position Job is in right here where we're at in this book. And it's because, unlike Job, we really do deserve the punishment that's coming to us. And for us, the punishment that we deserve, it's an eternal one. And so in the face of this, we cry out the very same thing. I have sinned and earned death. God, I am guilty. If only there was someone to mediate between us, someone to bring us together, someone to remove your rod from me. And God, I know that you have provided me this in your Son, Jesus. What incredible foreshadowing of Christ we see right here in the pages of the very Old Testament book of Job. The conversations between Job and his friends continue. The second round of conversations begins in chapter 15, as we noted before when we worked through our timeline. Again, Eliphaz starts it off. He starts talking again. And in verses 7 through 13 of chapter 15, Eliphaz makes this incredible, ironic demonstration of godly wisdom versus worldly wisdom. And if we can get to it, I want to hit that pretty hard during the midweek. Job replies, and in part of that, he says in chapter 16, verses 4 through 5, I also could speak like you if you were in my place. I could make fine speeches against you and shake my head at you, but my mouth would encourage you. Comfort from my lips would bring you relief. And so Job brings up what we heard James say in chapter 3, verse 10, out of the same mouth come praise and cursing. My brothers, this should not be. Job reminds us here that we are absolutely capable of cursing and blessing through speech. Job is going through some serious trials here, and his friends are using that opportunity to absolutely tear him apart when they could have been using this opportunity to encourage him in the Lord. And there's this challenge for us that comes through this as well. This is a good reminder for us that we need to always make sure we are building each other up in our speech and not tearing each other down. And the conversation continues, and through all of this, though, Job doesn't lose his faith. Right? And this is the whole beauty of the virtue of Job. He complains and he moans, but he never ever loses his faith through any of this. And check out this amazing statement that Job utters in chapter 19, verses 23 through 27. Oh, that my words were recorded, that they were written on a scroll, that they were inscribed with an iron tool on lead, or engraved in rock forever. I know that my Redeemer lives, and that in the end he will stand on the earth. And after my skin has been destroyed, yet in my flesh I will see God. I myself will see him with my own eyes, I and not another. How my heart yearns within me. Amen. And then we move on to the third round of dialogue. Eliphaz doubles down, or maybe we should say triples down, on the doctrine of divine retribution. Chapter 22, here's verses 4 through 11. Is it for your piety that he rebukes you and brings charges against you? Is not your wickedness great? Are not your sins endless? You demanded security from your relatives for no reason. You stripped people of their clothing, leaving them naked. You gave no water to the weary, and you withheld food from the hungry. Though you were a powerful man owning land, an honored man living on it, and you sent widows away empty-handed and broke the strength of the fatherless. That is why snares are all around you, why sudden peril terrifies you, why it is so dark you cannot see, and why a flood of water covers you. So here Eliphaz reiterates the doctrine of divine retribution, and he makes false accusations against Job. Job didn't do the things that he was just saying he did. He's just saying, because you've been punished, this means you must have done these things. Says them as facts. Later on, Job's going to refute and says he didn't do these things. He does this, like we said, to back up these claims about divine retribution. And in doing this, he demonstrates the classic execution of circular logic that we see so much in our society today. Here's how this works in diagram form. Eliphaz says, Job, you must have sinned. And Job says, no, I didn't. Why do you say that? And Eliphaz responds, well, because of divine retribution. Bad things are happening to you, Job. God only does that when you sin. And Job says, well, how do you know things work that way? And Eliphaz says, well, because you've sinned. Look what happened. Right? See the circular logic here? The assumption is false, but because of the way it gets laid out, it's this self-proving thing. It's wrong, but that never stops people from doing this. This is the flawed logic that his friends were using, and people still use this flawed logic today. You guys are familiar with this. People will say, the climate, she's a-changing. And then they'll say, this is being done by man. It's all our fault. We need to ruin the economy and enslave ourselves to the globalists so we can be saved from all of this. And then we ask the question, well, how do you know that's true? And the answer, because it's getting hotter. Right? There's plenty of other ways this logic gets used against us. But you guys get the idea. It goes around and around and around. Watch out for this fallacy of logic. Anyway, the back and forth continues between Job and his friends, and then this guy named Elihu comes along. So Job and his three friends go back and forth 3 times over many, many chapters, and they're at kind of a stalemate, right? Job's friends keep accusing him of sinning. Job complains about his situation. He maintains his innocence. Not a perfect man, but Clearly, he says he didn't do the things he's being accused of, and his friends aren't listening, and none of them are convincing each other, and they just go around and around. And now this other guy, Elihu, shows up, and he decides that the book of Job just isn't long enough at this point, and so he weighs in and he gives his opinion too. And to be honest with you, I've really struggled over my position on all of this, on what Elihu has said. I'm still not sure whether Elihu is the voice of reason or the most ridiculous one of them all. And if you also struggled between which of these things he is, you're in good company, because many, many Bible scholars are divided on this as well. And due to the constraints of time, we're just going to leave this part alone. But in summary, Elihu comes along, he decides to speak up, and he first beats up Job's friends for not actually addressing Job's point. But then he turns on Job and attacks him because of, divine retribution. And then finally, we get to chapter 38, and the Lord speaks. Verses 1 through 3. Then the Lord spoke to Job out of the storm. He said, "Who is this that obscures my plans with words without knowledge?" I love that statement. "Brace yourself like a man. I will question you, and you shall answer me." So this giant storm comes along, and God speaks. And God rebukes Job. So Job, as it said in the beginning, Job didn't sin throughout the book by bad-mouthing God or charging him with wrongdoing. That's Job's virtue, right? That's our example. But God says that because Job said that God had become his enemy, which is what it felt like to Job, this testimony, God said, could confuse people, could confuse other people about what was going on. And so God basically says, Job, you have no idea what's going on here. You don't understand my plans. And so you talking in ignorance about my plans that you don't understand, that's actually obscuring them. And so God says to Job, brace yourself. I'm going to ask you some questions now. Here's verses 4 through 7. Where were you when I laid the earth's foundation? Tell me if you understand. Who marked off its dimensions? Surely you know. Who stretched a measuring line across it? On what were its footings set? Or who laid its cornerstone? While the morning stars sang together and all the angels shouted for joy. God asks Job some questions that put Job in his place. Where were you when I laid the earth's foundation? Tell me if you understand. How absolutely humbling is that? God is telling Job, who are you to question me? And God starts outlining these magnificent things that he's done, things that we have absolutely no concept of how to do. And God goes on like this through the end of chapter 41. God essentially confronts Job with the ultimate question. The entire point of this book, the very same question that you and I should be confronted with when we read this very same book. Who are you to look at a tiny slice of what has happened and judge God? Who are you? Here is precisely what has just happened in the entire book of Job. We get introduced to this man named Job, and he lives on the earth, and he's wealthy, and he's a godly man. But then the story quickly switches to the heavens, and we see God, and we see Satan, and we see this conversation between the two of them, and this conversation results in some terrible trials befalling Job. And Job suffers, and he suffers. And as we pointed out last week, we're seeing this story from a different perspective than Job did. Right? Reading the book, from chapter 1, we're aware of what's going on. We're aware of the conversation between God and Satan. Job was not. So this is our perspective on the story. This was not Job's perspective. Job's perspective didn't look like this. Job's perspective looked like this. And so Job suffered, and he had no idea why. And so he said, woe is me. And he doesn't charge God with wrongdoing, but he starts making all of these assumptions. He says, God has become my enemy, and God is nowhere to be found. Otherwise, I would be able to make an appeal. In other words, Job has no idea what's going on here because he has no idea what's going on up here. And this is exactly why the book of Job is so incredibly important to us. Because like we said last week, all of us are going to find ourselves in a Job-type situation in our lives at some point. Here's some examples. Young man loses his job, and he's already behind on the bills. And this is the straw that breaks the camel's back and brings him to total financial ruin. And he goes home after being fired, and he looks up to heaven and he cries out through tear-filled eyes, "My God, why are you letting this happen to me? God, what am I supposed to do now?" Mother of 2 young children lies in a hospital bed dying of cancer. And she loves God and she loves her family, and she can't understand why all of this is happening, and she struggles so much. She doesn't understand what's going on, but she doesn't accuse God of wrongdoing, but she asks her husband and her friends, "Why has God become my enemy?" Another young man is cut down in the prime of his life, tragically dying in a car accident, leaving those around him in his church wondering, why in the world would God let something like this happen to such a good guy? In every single one of these cases, the natural reaction of everyone is the same as Job's reaction. Woe is me! Why has God turned against me? And it's all for the very same reason that Job did what he did. It's because of ignorance about what's going on up here. And look, the Bible has already told us there is a whole spiritual realm up there that you and I cannot see. And although the Bible tells us every single detail that you and I actually need to know about what's going on up there, we have no real-time information whatsoever. You and we're just like Job. We're completely ignorant to God's greater plans for us. And so we suffer and we question because we don't have the full perspective. But God does. That young man who died in the car accident, God took him home early because he knew that if he didn't, this young man would commit a terribly evil act the next year. And the young mother dying of cancer, God used her mightily even though she never knew. A woman she didn't know, didn't even see, came in to visit the person who was sharing the hospital room and came to the bed next to her, but overheard the young woman's earnest, quiet prayer. And this woman hears the stranger speak, hears her prayers, and is moved to tears. She goes home, reads her Bible, and gives her life to Christ, and goes on to bring many to the kingdom. And the woman dying in the hospital room never knew the impact or how God used her. And the young man in financial trouble who lost his job, he would suffer for a while, and then he would get a better job where he would meet the love of his life, and they would get married and grow old together and have many children who would grow up to know the Lord. Just as it was with Job, God didn't become Job's enemy. God wasn't playing games with Job. This wasn't about God proving something to Satan. It wasn't anything like that. God made Job to suffer tremendously, and in doing so, God provided an example and hope to every single person on earth who has come ever since. For 4,000 years now, longer than that, every single person who has come along has been able to learn from and be encouraged by the sufferings that Job went through and this book, the way it was recorded. And God did that because He knew that all of us coming after Job would suffer too. And God knew that we would need a story like Job's to help put everything into perspective, because none of us knows everything that's going on up here. And so you see, Solomon was right. We simply cannot fathom God's plans from beginning to end. We can't know all this stuff that's going on up here, but God hasn't kept us in the dark. The Bible shows us that this is not what our picture looks like. It's not. This is not what our picture looks like. This is what our picture looks like. God knows that you can't know all the details about what's going on. Remember, Solomon says you cannot fathom God's plans from beginning to end. God knows our limitations, and so He's assured us in our limited perspective, in our limited capacity, He has assured us that we know that in all things God works for the good of those who love Him, who are called according to His purpose, full stop. And my friends, this is all we need to know about the situation. And honestly, we're not truly capable of knowing and understanding much more than that. And us demanding for God to justify Himself to us when we don't understand something, that is the absolute height of arrogance and pride. Where were you when I laid the earth's foundation? Tell me if you understand. Who marked off its dimensions? Surely you know. Who stretched a measuring line across it? On what were its footings set? Or who laid its cornerstone? While the morning stars sang together and all the angels shouted for joy. And look, we see here in chapter 42, there's a happy ending to all of this. Job humbles himself. He repents. God restores him to a position of even greater wealth than he had before. There's a happy ending. God gives Job more than he had. And yes, I'm sure the pain of the loss was still there, but God put him through all of that for a purpose. And there was a tremendous reward waiting for him at the end. And my friends, this is the very same thing that is true for us. There's a reward waiting for us at the end of our trials. Maybe it's restoration in this life like Job experienced it. Maybe we'll have to wait for the next one. But there is magnificent treasures waiting for us in heaven. It is all we need to know. God is in charge, and we are not. The gentlemen will come forward. We'll enjoy the Lord's Supper together. We will close out and call it a morning. Would you bow with me in prayer? Dear Lord, again, we thank you so much for letting us gather together today to worship you as a family. We thank you so much for giving us the book of Job. Thank you for the beautiful poetry that is in there. Thank you for the conversations that were captured. Thank you for the example of Job, and we can see his very, very human-like reaction to not understanding the greatness of your plans, and yet him holding on to his faith and not cursing you despite his struggles. Thank you so much for this. We ask that you would please give us wisdom from these things. And as we have just breezed through it, Lord, just to get the high-level view of all of this so we can see how it connects with everything else. We see, Lord, as this is just one more part of your unbroken story that points us to Jesus and we can apply directly to our lives. How amazing is your word, Lord, that it can come together. This thing that happened thousands of years ago was so perfectly relevant to us today. Lord, we marvel at you and your power through all of this. We thank you for loving us enough to preserve this word and share it with us. We ask you to help us be able to apply it and become better sons and daughters to you as a result. We love you dearly. We pray these things in Jesus' name. Amen.